show up. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be joined by some members of Utah Health Workers United, which is the newly formed union for the University of Utah Healthcare System. We are joined by Caleb Wilson, works in the burn trauma IU, Garrett Schwinke, who is a current DNP student, Jessica Stouffer, who works in acute care, and Talmadge Nelson, who is an AEMT. I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves a little bit more with our first question, and that is, I'll start with Caleb, because I landed on your face first. I wonder if you could start us off just telling us a little bit about your medical specialty and what were some elements of your working conditions that made you realize that things needed to change for your job to become sustainable.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me. So my name is Caleb Wilcox. I'm a nurse on the burn trauma ICU. I've been there for about 2 years. Before becoming a nurse, I worked in mental health and education for 10 years. So I've been very people focused for most of my adult life, and it's been really remarkable working at this hospital. It's been an incredible place to work in many regards, and working with burn patients has really been a fantastic experience working with the patients, with the staff, and just learning a lot there and all the support I've received. And during that time, a lot of my coworkers have, expressed needs that aren't being met by the system. And I've seen literally dozens of people leave in the last 2 years. And like with that, I've also seen knowledge, experience, and safety leave as well. So I am invested in people, and I want things to change and be better for the people that I care about and for my patients in the community on a broader sense.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Jessica, I'll turn the question to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your medical specialty and what made you realize that things had to change?
So for the first 5 years that I was a nurse, I worked specifically on inpatient medical psych, and worked as a charge nurse. And I thought there were just issues with that unit. And so when I left there, I became an acute care resource nurse, and I float now to 20 locations through the hospital. So I feel like I have a pretty broad perspective on issues. But something that I've realized more and more as post-COVID time has gone on is that our dietary reps are like 2 people for 420 beds. Meanwhile, I have 5 patients, sometimes total cares, so I'm already doing extra work, and they just wheel the meal carts out and then expect us to pass them out, and they're supposed to get orders for everyone and effectively pass out those meals or get missed items, and it just becomes a hodgepodge. And I'm the one directly dealing with the patient, so most times I go and get whatever's needed or missing, even though that takes away from patient care in the long run.
Thank you. Talmadge, I'll turn the question to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your medical specialty and what was a trigger point that told you things need to change around here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Talmadge. Thanks for having me. Uh, I'm licensed as what's called an advanced EMT, which is a level between EMT basic and paramedic. So my background is in emergency medicine, but I actually work up at Huntsman in a clinical setting. So I'm what's called a medical assistant up there. The moment I knew that things needed to change was honestly probably the moment I got hired at the university. Yeah, and not a second later. It was probably on the first day where I was like, the dysfunction and the chaos of this job just is not okay for patients in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, it was the second I started.
Thank you. And Garrett, I'll turn that question to you. Can you tell us a little bit? I know you're moving into a different medical specialty, but where you've been and what's taught you that things needed to change?
Yeah, my name's Garrett. I'm a former oncology nurse at Huntsman of a few years. I think what really crystallized for me over my time as a nurse, working with my colleagues, was that our humanity was being eclipsed by our utility for the hospital system. And that had profound health implications for myself and my colleagues. And when you have a sick healthcare workforce trying to take care of sick patients, that's a lot hangs in the balance. and that was unacceptable to me. And so that's why I'm a part of this effort.
Thank you. And I'll take us back around the round robin for our next question. Caleb, can you talk a little bit about how UHWU came to be and how you became involved in the organizing process?
Yeah, definitely. So for many years, the U has sought employee feedback through listening sessions, their well-check surveys, their U Help Better surveys, their conversations and everything. And for years, us healthcare workers have been bringing forward concerns about staffing, about pay, about burnout, about how we're treated, about the care that the patients are receiving. And I mean, the hospital is always monitoring, these metrics on patient outcomes. And so we've been giving information for years and we haven't seen the changes that we believe are necessary. And so everyone that's a part of the union, we're working right now. Many of us are students, some of us are parents, and we don't necessarily want to be doing this and devoting our so much time and energy every week, but we're doing this because we believe it's necessary. And I think that just as someone who is like plugged into the system, I am worried about the direction that it's going, and my conscience just requires me to participate in this.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'd love to ask you a follow-up question, which is, you referenced all these initiatives that, the U is doing, and like these listening sessions and everything. Kind of at what point did it become clear that the change that was needed was not coming from that? Was it just kind of a static, nothing was really happening? What was sort of that brought you into this idea, like, I need to do something about this?
Yeah, like I said, there's been like a many years long history of this. And like things continue to get worse. And I have seen that trend for myself even in the last 2 years. And I just feel that things need to change.
Thank you. Jessica, I'll turn to you. Can you talk about how UHWU came to be and how you became involved in the organizing process?
Yeah, so I feel like I got organized relatively early on in this process. United Healthcare Workers was an Instagram that is still functioning, hopefully to help IHC unionize, much like we did. However, that gave us a platform and a space to start the process. And from there, I kept going to meetings, and our first meeting was last January 30th of 2023. So in my mind, we're not even a year old. And to be public and everything already is a huge leap and bound. So hopefully we can continue new member education and keep moving. But that's kind of where we started, was from Instagram, and then we just started organizing from there.
That's very cool. Can I ask why Instagram was was it just what happened to be there?
Yeah, that just kind of happened to be there. I didn't follow that account right away, but what I can say is it was during COVID. I'm a senior enough nurse that I remember what nursing pre-COVID was like, and then COVID happened. And then I started seeing these memes or this reel or these things that were related within Utah to healthcare. And I was like, holy shit, this is Utah. This is being run by a Utah nurse. And was really excited about that because there were lots of cracks, and COVID really painted those cracks wide for us.
Thank you. Talmadge, how did you become involved in the organizing process?
Yeah. So for me, UHWU came to be simply because of the working conditions that we exist under necessitated its creation. So it feels like a very organic thing for me to come about. It's a product of its environment. But personally, I had a friend of a mutual friend that told me that this process was starting up, and I've basically been pro-union all my life. So when I heard about it, I was like, absolutely, sign me up. Let me know what I can do. How can I get organized, and how can I participate? So
Fantastic. Thank you. And being pro-union, that's something that you don't always see in Utah, I found.
it's a little rare here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't exactly come with the territory, that's for sure. So
Has that been something that you feel UHWU has kind of crashed up against in its baby year?
You know what? Actually, the conditions of collective bargaining in the state of Utah have made it complicated, no doubt. But I think unions in general and making working conditions better for people is completely uncomplicated. There's nothing, to me, even political about it. It's as simple as in order for us to live healthy and dignified lives, we need to be getting, a certain amount of pay. We need to have a certain standards in place, whether it's like safety conditions or staffing ratios. We need all those things in order for us to have a functioning system. And if those things aren't in place, then nobody's happy. Whatever end of the political spectrum you fall on, it doesn't matter. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable way to think about unions. And Gary, I'll turn that question to you. How did you become involved in organizing UHWU?
Yeah, I was kind of galvanized by the transparent conversations about compensation and working conditions that were hosted on the social media that Jessica referenced. And we really got underway with a blueprint for organizing last January when we secured a relationship with CWA District 7 in Colorado and Arizona. Actually surveyed workers at the University of Utah in June of 2022 about their interest in organizing, and there was a really resounding positive response. And so Carlos Martinez, who's on the call, is actually our staff organizer for CWA, and he helped us form an organizing committee and really form the structure that we needed to organize in earnest. And I just wanted to point out just the high caliber of these people. I'm really proud to work with them. Caleb, Talmadge, Jessica, every one of my colleagues. Lena's on the call. We have phenomenal healthcare workers who are phenomenal people who are taking time out of their personal lives to do this work because it's necessary and important. So I'm just really proud to be among them.
Thank you. We'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the challenges that you've encountered in the organizing process. And Caleb, we'll start with you. Can you talk about one of the challenges that you've encountered, if it surprised you, and how you dealt with it or didn't deal with it, as the case may be?
Absolutely. One of the main challenges that we faced is the socio-political landscape of Utah, being at will, right to work, and our state motto being industry. And so what those things mean, there's a lot of misconceptions around them of at-will employment. People commonly misinterpret that as meaning they cannot participate in a union, when in reality it just means that union participation cannot be a condition of employment. The right to work is a scary thing for many people because that basically means that you can quit at any time, but also your boss can fire you at any time for almost any reason. And union participation is protected under federal law, but what would stop someone from making up, a bogus claim and letting you go for allegedly another reason? So that fear of retribution is something that a lot of folks have expressed concern over and as a barrier to participation. And that's, people with kids, people with debt, it's just hard having the time and energy to commit to this, especially if you believe that your employment is on the line. And there's many more people at the hospital and clinics who believe that, what is the cost of not participating in this? Utah ranks 37th for nursing pay. And when you factor in the cost of living that has increased dramatically along the Wasatch Front the last several years, that comes with a lot of other costs that aren't as, immediately obvious. Being a healthcare worker has a huge toll on people's physical health, their mental well-being. The suicide rate for nurses is 18% 5% above the general population. There's high rates of back injury and chronic pain. And, we're at a point where many healthcare workers can't afford to buy a house or live near the hospital. And so there's all these compounding factors that are making this less and less sustainable, that's driving people either away from bedside to different states that pay healthcare workers better. A brand new nurse in Portland, Oregon will make $30,000 more their first year than a starting nurse in Utah. And so there's a lot of reasons for people to leave. And with that high turnover, that's loss of knowledge, experience, and safety. And so it just really is, a lot of people are waking up to this fact that we do need a change.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Jessica, can you talk a little bit about a challenge that you personally encountered in organizing? And did it surprise you, and how did you respond to it?
Yeah, so one of the things within organizing is talking about a union, obviously, and that's kind of a taboo subject in Utah. And we're pretty trained from a young age to not talk about it, and that you could get fired from work and all these things, even though you have protected rights on the state level and the federal level. But one of the things people are commonly worried about is going on strike, and they think that if our union gets big enough, we're going to strike right away. And that's just one of the tools in our tool belt. It's one of many tools. And it's kind of the last case, worst case scenario. We've exhausted all other measures. We've tried petitions. We've tried in-house meetings. We've tried inviting them to the table. And so it's a last case scenario for us. It's not something we want to just go jumping right into. And so trying to educate people that there's more to a union than striking. But they commonly hear just about strikes on the news. And so it's kind of what they know being from Utah. So trying to give them that other education on what a union can do and help them with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, that unions are only visible when they're on strike generally. Talmadge, how about you? What was a challenge that you've encountered in organizing, whether it was talking to someone or trying to share the message, or something else? And how did you react to that?
I think for me, one of the challenges I've encountered, probably more than anything else, is just dispelling some really elementary disinformation that gets floated around. Things like, you can't organize in the state of Utah. You can't have a union in the state of Utah. How is it that you guys think this is going to work? Which we have unionized, and we are currently unionized, and we are practicing as a union. So dispelling those like really basic things has proved challenging for me, or things like the university is prohibited from recognizing or dealing with our union, which is a prohibition that they themselves have put in place. It's their policy that they will not deal with our union, which can be changed by them just as easily as it can be, restricted by them. So those are some of the challenges I've seen in dealing with them. I think just getting people the proper education has been one of the things we've tried to do. And we've tried to host some classes and get some Zoom education out there, and just make people more efficient and well-read organizers in their process of getting their workplaces organized. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Do you think that I know people have talked about, hot union summer. Do you think that that shift has made its way to Utah yet? Or do you think that's still kind of making its way here?
I think it absolutely has. I think there's rumblings at other hospital networks, and we've heard some things at other hospital networks and other workplaces here, and I think that unions are going to take Utah by storm.
Fingers crossed.
That's my feeling.
Thank you. And Garrett, turn the question to you. What challenges have you encountered? Was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, I think the sort of baseline of fear about, and this is kind of adding to what Caleb already mentioned, but there's been a history of retribution and retaliation against nurses and other healthcare workers in Utah for organizing, particularly at Intermountain. A number of efforts were squashed throughout the years, and a number of independent voices, healthcare worker voices, were silenced for speaking out against conditions or things of that nature. And I just wanted to also point out that while nurses are underpaid here, everyone else is too. Nurses are kind of a good proxy for wages throughout the healthcare system. And that's why we're particularly pleased to be a wall-to-wall pre-majority union. Wall-to-wall meaning any employee, any healthcare worker, any health worker really, and counted among those are environmental services and nutrition and valet and all the other services that support the work of the hospital. It was important for us to include all of those people in this effort. So I think yeah, we want to expand that in terms of diversity and inclusion.
I think that's one of the things that is most exciting to me about UHWU is that commitment. Have any of the folks who've been in non-nursing or non-physician occupations, have they been surprised by you coming to them, or has it been like, oh, thank goodness somebody is here?
I've found some confusion, I would say, overall, once again, of lack of information on what a wall-to-wall or pre-majority union actually means. So some of the entities outside of nursing are like, thank goodness the nurses are doing something so they can help us. And in reality, it's like, no, you can be part of it too, and you can organize your own space and advocate for yourself. So there's a learning curve with that for sure. But I do think overall excitement that they are not excluded and that they can be a part and let their own voice be heard is huge.
Exciting. So one of the key points that UHWU has reinforced in interviews and press announcements is that advocating for healthcare workers is advocating for patients. So I'm curious, what kind of support have you seen from community members or entities who aren't directly impacted by healthcare working conditions? And Caleb, I'll start with you.
Well, I would say that everyone is impacted by healthcare working conditions. Our working conditions are other people's healing conditions. And we've all known people who have been in the hospital or we've been there ourselves. And I mean, would you rather have someone who, with many years of experience, who is stuck at the bedside, or someone who has been there for less than 2 years? We've seen like catheter associated urinary tract infection rates go up 200%. 200% in 2023. Among other like patient outcomes that have gotten worse. I would say that we are all affected by this. Some of the support, we're still reaching out and creating support networks among other people. We have joined with the AFL-CIO, which is sort of like a union of unions. So we're working alongside electricians and plumbers, mail carriers, teachers, because we recognize that, this isn't just about us. This is about like our society on a grander scale and the common person. And we're just a part of this larger class struggle. So we've received solidarity and shared solidarity with other folks of other working class professions, as well as like other members of the CWA. The CWA helped Denver Health unionize a couple of years ago, and we've gotten solidarity from them. And yeah, and I think that that is an area that we're going to focus on moving forward as well, is just focusing on getting this information out there. Because I believe that, the public should be able to make an informed decision about their priorities and the type of care that they want to receive.
Thank you. Jessica, I'll turn the question to you. How have folks in your circle who are not healthcare workers or in the community, how have they reacted to this announcement?
So I've had no major outreaches other than what Caleb's already said to me personally, but neighbors and non-healthcare people who I don't necessarily talk with have come over and been like, congratulations on starting a union. And part of advocating for healthcare workers is advocating for patients, is because anybody at any time can become that patient. And it could be your family member or your friend, but we all have incidences happen where you end up in the hospital, and it does make a difference. And so, once again, if you only have one clinical pharmacist around for 425 beds, that's illogical on the time spent. And it's not until you escalate your call enough that that person then shows up when really you needed them 30 minutes ago, but they weren't able to come. And so that affects all of us. And I think the community as a general doesn't understand that outright. It's not something we generally talk about, right? We pretend everything is going okay, even though it's sometimes a dumpster fire. And so I think kind of reaching out to the community and having that knowledge base, so that in turn we can ask them for help and support, and showing solidarity with us is going to be huge overall. And we're starting those relationships slowly but surely.
Absolutely. Something that you mentioned made me think of this. I think a lot of the times when something, adverse happens to someone in the healthcare system, they're inclined to blame an individual. Do you feel like that is kind of what happens? Or are people beginning to realize that the larger organization and system plays a role?
Yeah, I think a lot of times the larger system just kind of blames that one individual. And I think as individuals, we're realizing that no one person can fix this. We need to organize, and we need to have our voices collectively heard, because so far we've filled out the surveys and things, and nothing's really helped our voices be heard. We haven't seen staffing ratios change for the better. We haven't seen our supplies change for the better. We haven't seen us getting paid for the better to help these scenarios that we've been talking about. So that's kind of why we are doing what we're doing and trying to change it on our own.
Absolutely. Talmadge, what kind of reaction did you get from people when they found out that UHWU was unionizing? Did you feel supported from the community, your immediate community, or the larger community, or did you feel that people didn't quite understand what was happening?
I personally and anecdotally, I feel like in the people that I've talked to, whether peers or even strangers, I felt mostly support. I've never really heard anybody like push back on the idea that unions are going to be good for the community just at large. I had a friend who reached out to me recently because we were talking about our union, and he's down in Colorado at our at one of our CWA affiliated hospital networks, and he was telling me about how the job he's at, which is in an ununionized part of the hospital, pays $10 less than the unionized part of the hospital. And he was like, I think it's so cool that you guys are participating in this, and hopefully soon you can find me a contact so I can get a job at the unionized portion at the hospital. So that to me screams community support, and so does 71% approval of unions in America. I think that's a Gallup poll, if I'm remembering correctly, but I don't know. That's a lot of support to me.
I think it's really interesting that so many Americans seem to be in support of unions, and yet so few Americans belong to unions.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea why that is in your experience?
Well, the union movement, historically, it was beaten back and rights were stripped away, to the point where corporations they had the upper hand in all workplace negotiations. It was a systematic stripping of union power and worker power. It was, done over the course of decades, and where we find ourselves at now is a world where workers do not have as much power to exercise as they did in previous years. And I think we're starting to come back to that, but yeah, that's where we're at right now, and we're having to recover ground that was lost, in the 60s, 70s, and onward. So
Absolutely. Thank you. Garrett, how about you? What's been your perception of community support?
Overwhelmingly positive. I can't think of a single negative response. And the university's own policy is one of neutrality. So that's encouraging, as far as I'm concerned. We appreciate that UPower invited us to this seminar series. That's helpful for us to communicate about what's going on in healthcare right now. just to tack on to what Talmadge mentioned about um, decreasing union engagement, I'm imagining that the rising curve of inequality and is the inverse of engagement with unions. I hope we can turn that around in this country. I think it's desperate. I think that's one of the things that continues to compel me to engage with this, is that people are desperate. And they're desperate because their lives are precarious. And I think the precariousness of their lives is by design, and I reject that. We can do better in this country. We can do better in this state, and we must do better in this state. If we're going to have a functioning healthcare system in Utah in 5-10 years, we've got to massively overhaul how we compensate workers, how we treat workers, and the conditions under which they work. Because the U.S. Surgeon General, I don't know if it was 22 or 23, indicted hospital systems, healthcare systems for worker burnout, and I would add to that moral injury. And I haven't seen any response, right? And so you can't shame power into self-correcting. You have to speak power to power, and that's what this is about, speaking power to power.
I think it's interesting that earlier, I think it was Caleb referenced how precarity was something that kept people from wanting to become involved in the union, but it seems like that's a double-edged sword, where precarity may actually prompt folks to become more involved with the union. I'll ask one more question, then I'm going to turn this over to our audience. But Caleb, what would you like to see the larger community? What would you like to see organizations? What would you like patients to do? What kind of support could folks give to UHWU? What kind of buy-in would you like to see from that larger community?
I think ideally, having folks write to their representatives, their senators and representatives, and just ask them to consider this and take a look at this. Right now, we are, trying to engage with hospital executives and shareholders and everything. But being a public institution, their boss is the state. And so by having public support, by people having conversations with their friends and family about this, and just all getting on the same page, I think that, people have the power. Well, in large part, it's the workers, but it's also public perception is a valuable tool in our box as well. And so recognizing that, what's good for us is good for everyone, and like the necessity of that, and just the continual decline in our health and our availability as we're doing everything we can. Like, please reach out to your representatives, get them on board, talk to the hospital if you know people up top. So
Absolutely. Thank you. Jessica, what kind of support would you like to see from the larger community?
There's a wide variety of support, much as a wide variety of being an active member. But with that being said, simple things like following our Instagram account. We have a YouTube channel, maybe watching some videos, throwing up some likes, things like that are super helpful. Signing petitions when they're coming out, going to rallies are things I would love to see. Obviously, they can give us donations at any point on our website, which is also helpful to run those rallies and varying things. Like Caleb was saying, contact your editor, or not editors, but they're on there too, but legislators, and trying to just get an overall community support, because it really does affect all of us in our community as a whole. Healthcare is one of those necessary evils.
Absolutely. One thing that you and a couple others have referenced is that this is all volunteer on your part. This is what you're doing, not just for yourselves, but for the wider community. Do you think that folks realize that when there's been so much misinformation about unions? Do you think people know that this is not something you're doing to be paid buckets and buckets of money for?
We are really trying to let them know that it's ground level movement. It's workers who are working full-time jobs and doing other family things and maintaining all of their normal requirements within life, and in addition to doing this organization. And I think part of that is because we do feel so strongly that we're kind of getting a short end of a stick. And I think a lot of workers are getting that short end, and a lot are a lot more unsettled about it and willing to make that change. It's kind of like we've talked about before, is the precarious situation, right? And we're unwilling to continue living like this. And so that's kind of spearheading that change overall.
Absolutely. Thank you. Talmadge, what kind of community support would you like to see? What kind of buy-in do you think that the community could demonstrate to UHWU?
Yeah, I think as Jessica said, I think probably one of the most simple would be financial support, of course, but there's a million different ways that we could get support from the community. A while ago, we were asking for people with experience with like website design. We were asking for people who have access to like speakers or intercom systems, because when we host our meetings, we want it to be as professional and sophisticated as possible. So people with audio experience, people with web design experience, data collection experience, literally anything that they can bring to this effort is useful to us. People who have I don't know, a good recipe for peanut brittle, any of the above, like whatever it is. If you make a mean cake or brownie, bring it to a meeting. We would love that.
Sick. Garrett, is there anything you'd add to that? Any sort of support you'd like to see from the larger community?
Yeah, first, I just wanted to follow up on what Talmadge said as far as, everybody has talents and skills, and this work is big enough and wide enough and deep enough that we can find something for you to do if you want to help out. And yeah, House Bill 285 is going to be presented on the floor tomorrow in the Utah legislature. It is fundamentally an anti-union bill. It restricts the rights of certain public unions in Utah to take dues from paychecks. So call your representative and tell them to vote no on House Bill 285. That's a great, simple thing to do. A more complex thing to do is to support healthcare reform in this country. We need massive healthcare reform, and unions are a small part of addressing the shortfalls in our systems. But generally being supportive of healthcare reform and demanding better at your local government level is essential. We pay more for healthcare in this country than literally any country in the world, and our outcomes are middle tier at best. They're last among OEI countries. I can't remember that phrase. In any case, OED, I think. In any case, we need to demand better. We need to stop accepting the status quo, because it's not serving anyone. It's not freedom. It's not well-being. It's not happiness.
Thank you. I have another question I'd love to ask, but I've hogged this time too long. So does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to ask our panelists?
I do.
Please go ahead.
Hey, so do you guys have any comments on the law that just passed, the EDI modifications and changes, and how that's going to affect the strategic initiatives that had been set out, for the benefit of trying to even out the workforce in health a little, and that has been like negated as a something that merits priority or attention in any way, because in deference of everybody needs to get the same thing. And so I wonder what is your take on that from that union perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak to that first. Thank you for that question. And like my view of this is everything is like intersectional, but we are focused on improving healthcare and patient outcomes for everyone. And a large part of that is like having access to education. And I saw like an article, I think, from the Salt Lake Tribune today about how this new DEI law or bill will affect like funding for members of the Ute tribe trying to go to the University of Utah and affecting this long-standing agreement between them. And I think that, you know, what's good, like class struggle is very much related to the systemic racism in our country and systemic sexism, transphobia, all of these things are very deeply ingrained and related. And I personally oppose that bill.
Thank you. Anyone else from UHWU want to weigh in on that?
I agree, and I think that was elegantly said. I'm just gonna second all of that, so.
I'll
Yeah.
co-sign it too.
Excellent. All right, we have got one question in the chat that I'll ask. This question is about improving workplace ventilation. Has that been on your radar at all, especially given, you know, COVID and all the other respiratory diseases happening? And oftentimes the objection to that from companies is, oh, this is too expensive. So what has been your experience with that? Garrett, please.
Go ahead, Jess, and I'll follow up.
I just want to say that regularly we will have buildings with leaks, or we find an issue with inside the building, and we still work in and around all of that, even though we know black mold isn't necessarily good. I personally still am wearing a mask. I've never stopped that practice from COVID. And I don't ever see myself really going back. And then I think that's to my advantage in the situations of like, oh, by the way, you know, this whole unit's closed for X time because 24 out of 26 rooms failed the mold challenge. And so those are things we don't talk about overall and kind of sweep under the rug. And with the turnover that we've seen recently, it's really hard for people to remember that that's even a thing. And of course, the university says they fixed it and got rid of it and had all the testing done, but I don't also believe them.
What would give you reassurance to know that they're beginning to help improve your environment?
Yeah, I would like to see some of the testing myself. I'd like to, you know, kind of have more of an open conversation with them and have access to that information, or more realistic timelines of how long it takes to actually get that stuff removed from the air or the environment. That's just the first one that comes to my mind, but we have a lot of ventilation issues beyond mold.
Absolutely. Garrett, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add the triple pandemic, the question about triple pandemic and ventilation, that specifically has not been on our radar, but I am aware of concerns in the operating room about certain byproducts of surgical procedures and how dangerous they are with respect to inhalation and the risk that they pose. And some of the ventilation requirements with respect to that have been opposed by, I can't remember if it's I think it's the American Hospital Association. In any case, there's a place in our union for specific concerns to be addressed. And I think it's imperative that our members like bring those concerns to us, and they are. There's also a place for caucuses within our union to address certain concerns for certain job roles. And so there are mechanisms for us to begin addressing those things. Of course, we'd like to address everything all at once, everywhere, all the time. But that's not possible. And but I appreciate the question because it drives home that like this is all about worker health and patient health and how inextricable those two are.
Absolutely. Emily, you had a question?
I was going to highlight a question in the chat, but you got it. But now there's another one, so I can go ahead and do that.
Okay, perfect.
In the chat, someone wants to know, what are some steps that a person who's not affiliated with the U could take to starting their own union or joining CWA?
I can speak, or Garrett. Okay. So one of the things that we've learned in this process is about the difference between more traditional labor union and what we call a pre-majority model. And so the path line to creating a union looks different based basically on if you're a public or private entity, and if your state grants public entities collective bargaining rights. So the state of Utah does not grant collective bargaining rights to public employees. And so what that means is just that the employer is not legally obligated to recognize the union. And so with that, it's important to keep in mind, the workers are the ones generating profit. Profit is whatever is left over after paying the workers and the cost of providing the service. And so as the folks who generate profit, you have a lot of power in this situation if you choose to organize. If possible, it's usually beneficial to go through the National Labor Relations Board, which then does have that mandate of your employer recognizing you. Some of the drawbacks to that, though, are you have to unionize by job code most of the time. With the pre-majority model, that's what allows us to be wall to wall. And there's like different steps to that, but it's more of a direct action model of taking things into your own hand rather than relying on laws.
Thank you. Garrett, anything you'd add to that, or did Caleb get it covered?
I was just going to add, I did put our email in the chat. Feel free to email us. And where we're not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, we have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and assembly and to petition the government for redress of our grievances. And so that's really kind of what we're organizing under is those First Amendment rights. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone in our audience have a question?
What are you most excited about? Let's put a time frame on it. You're a year old. What are you most excited about in the coming year?
I personally am hopeful to see another major hospital system kind of start the process that we started. I'm talking about IH, and hopefully they can start unionizing. It's a big thing that we were able to do this, and there's been a lot of previous attempts that have been busted one way or the other. And so hopefully if we can get more than one hospital entity to unionize, we'll develop that power more among the community and have more of that change along legislation side of things, and not just our own workplace.
Continuing to develop our membership and developing real power, which is really about a credible threat to withhold our labor.
Do you have number goals or that you're willing to share? If you are not willing to share those, that's fine. But
I don't know that we've specifically talked about number goals, to be honest, but I mean, obviously you need a majority or a super majority to really, I think, threaten credibly. But yeah, I don't know that we've specifically discussed that.
I have a question, and that's that I think a lot of times when folks think about their working conditions, they feel completely on their own. They feel like, oh, I'm vulnerable, I'm just going to be fired. At what point did you feel like that mindset shifted into, okay, now we're a collective and we're gaining protection with each person that we add to that collective?
When we first started organizing, before we were public and before we were kind of out and about, we said we would feel comfortable around 200 people. And that was across job titles across the board. And we surpassed that number by so much, we felt the need to go public sooner than we were maybe necessarily ready. I'd also argue, are you ever ready? So it's kind of part of that learning process and curve. And so obviously the more people we have, the bigger our voice and the more power we have. So hopefully we can keep growing. But currently we've blown a lot of expectations out of the water within our first few months of being public.
Awesome. Can I ask why 200? Did that just feel like a safe number, or was that based on anything?
Yeah, pretty much. We all kind of felt safe about it. We had talked about it over a couple of meetings. And that was just kind of that first number we had talked about. So yeah.
Excellent. Any other advice you'd give to somebody who's like, I really, my employer, I feel like I'm mistreated, but I feel like I'm way too vulnerable to be able to do anything. What advice would you give to them?
I'd like to answer this one. Talking about my experience and mentioning how I knew from like the minute I started at the university that things weren't where they needed to be in terms of our working conditions. I feel like I spent most of my early employment really not understanding that your coworkers are the best way for you to build power and protect yourself. Because I think in certain work environments, you often will find yourself being pitted against your coworkers. It benefits managers to turn everybody against each other and think that they're the enemy. That's why this isn't getting done. When the reality is there's nothing more, I think, powerful and empowering than getting together with your coworkers and really talking about what the issues in your department, clinic, etc. is, and how you can functionally change those things from the bottom up. So my advice is connect with your coworkers and find out what their issues are and find out how you all share the same challenges and working conditions, and that you're better off getting together and approaching those challenges as a collective and not just an individual.
Absolutely.
Can I follow up on that? I've had an experience in workplaces, various workplaces before, where you start, and Talmadge, I've also had that feeling at jobs before, where you start and you think, what's going on in this place? Like kind of immediately, right? For me, historically, it has often, as you said, taken me a long time to not think, well, it must just be me, right? Or maybe my expectations are too high, or maybe I'm seeing it, maybe I'm missing something, right? Like, how have you sort of found that other people, once you start talking to them, say pretty quickly, no, I've noticed that too, or yeah, what's up with that? Or how long has it taken people to warm up on those things?
I don't think it takes them long at all. I think it's almost immediate. I think everybody connects around talking about their workplace. And yeah, same exact experience. Basically, I spent so much of my working life not getting together with my coworkers and realizing that we had these common interests. And yeah, I don't know if that adequately answers your question, but I feel like it's so fast. I think it's completely uncomplicated for people. And when you start talking to them about these things, you realize that you share so many common interests with your coworkers, and not a whole lot with your whether it's your managers or administration, however far up the corporate ladder I suppose you want to climb. But that's where your common interest is, whether or not you get along with your coworkers. And yeah, being in an environment like that, though, I think I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. When you're in an environment where you think that everybody is out to get each other, everybody's stabbing each other in the back, and everybody is basically trying to, use you as a stepping stone to their goals, you don't have time to think about like organizing. You don't have time to, you're just trying to survive. You're trying to keep your head above water. And it took me until getting to the place where I'm at my clinic at Huntsman to realize, because I love all the people I work with at Huntsman, and being in a good working environment is what made me realize like what the heck was going on in those environments. this is so backwards and dysfunctional. So I had to be in a good place before I could realize how bad those other places were.
And I would say this is part of the reason we have gone so far so quickly, is that there is that commonality that people are very hungry for a change. And there's a list a mile long of what they want changed. And that's what's bringing us together.
Thank you. Gary?
I was just going to add, I think there's a massive gulf between how administration understands us and we understand ourselves and our own economic fears and anxieties. I don't think that those are accessible to them by virtue of their compensation and their position and their working conditions, which are so vastly superior to ours. And that's the sort of income and disparity of conditions that runs through this whole economy, our whole global economy right now. And I think workers here, and you know, you referenced the hot union summer, and there's been other movements elsewhere. I think people are becoming dissatisfied with the conditions of their work because it affects their health so much, often their mental health. Yeah. I find that people very quickly recognize this struggle is a class struggle, and those are where the lines are drawn. And the more we can focus on that, the less the less power, or the more power we take away from these other conflicts that they try to stoke.
Absolutely. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. Does anyone want to jump in with a last minute question? All right, I'm selfishly going to ask a last minute question, which is how would you like to see U of U Health respond to UHWU? What would you like to see leadership come and do? What would demonstrate good faith on their part?
Have some good faith conversations, invite us to the table, acknowledge that we're not just a play group, or we're not just out here kind of twiddling our thumbs, that we actually want to make a change for the better and it would benefit them too. I just don't think they see it yet overall. But it would be nice to be acknowledged and sit at a table and have a conversation with them and try and, you know, just even have a conversation.
Yeah.
There a Costco warehouse recently organized, and I can't remember where it was, this North Carolina, somewhere in the South or the East. Costco leadership sent out a letter expressing dismay in themselves that they allow the conditions of this warehouse to get to such a point that they, you know, the workers felt they needed to unionize. To see leadership take responsibility for conditions, for compensation, would be essential to moving forward.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much. I'm going to drop in a link to our evaluation in here, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank UHWU folks again so much for taking this time to be here and to answer our questions. And yeah, I think we're all wishing you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Can't
so
wait
much
to
for
see what
having
the
us.
future brings.
Yes,
Agreed.
absolutely.
Thank you.
And please do fill out our evaluation.
Yes.
We
Thank
Our
you.
evaluation team will be happy.
Yeah, they will love us.
Yes.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Everyone, thank you.
Bye,
Thanks for joining us,
Jessica.
Thanks, guys.
everybody.